Chapter 9, Part 1 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. The United States at War, Part 1. The entrance of the United States upon the war was a signal for a most active agitation of the question of overwhelming the enemy with illimitable fleets of aircraft. Though the agitation was most vociferous in this country whence it was hoped the enormous new fleets of aircraft would come, it was fomented and earnestly pressed by our Allies. France sent a deputation of her leading flyers over to supervise the instruction of our new pilots. England contributed experts to advise as to the construction of our machines. The most comprehensive plans were urged upon Congress and the administration for the creation of a navy of the air. A bill for an initial appropriation of $640 million for aircraft purposes alone was passed and one for a Department of Aeronautics to be established. Coordinate with those of War and the Navy, its secretary holding a seat in the Cabinet, was introduced in Congress. Many of the most eminent retired officers of the Navy joined in their support. Retired officers only because officers in active service were estopped from political agitation. There was every possible reason for this great interest in the United States in wartime aviation. The nation had long been shamefaced because the development of the heavier than air machines, having their origin undoubtedly in the inventive genius of Professor Langley and the Wrights, had been taken away from us by the more alert governments of France and Germany. The people were ready to buy back something of our lost prestige by building the greatest of air fleets at the moment when it should exercise the most determinative influence upon the war. But more. We entered upon the war in our chronic state of unpreparedness. We were without an army, and without equipment for one. To raise, equip, and drill an army of 1,000,000, the least number that would have any appreciable effect upon the outcome of the war, would take months. When completed, we would have added only to the numerical superiority of the Allies on the Western front. The quality of a novel and decisive contribution to the war would be lacking. So far it was with our Navy. The British Navy was amply adequate to deal with the German fleet should the latter ever leave its prudent retreat behind Helgoland and in the bases of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. True, it was not capable of crushing out altogether the submarine menace, but it did hold the German underwater boats down to a fixed average of ships destroyed, which was far less than half of what the Germans had anticipated. In this work our ships, especially our destroyers, took a notable part. The argument for a monster fleet of fighting aircraft thus came to the people of the United States in a moment of depression and perplexity. By land, the Germans had dug themselves in, holding all of Belgium and the thousands of square miles of France they had won in their first dash to the Marne. What they had won swiftly and cheaply could only be regained slowly and at heavy cost. True, the Allies were, day by day, driving them back from their position, but the cost was disheartening and the progress but slow. By sea the Germans refused to bring their fleet to battle with their foes, but from every harbor of Belgium and from Wilhelmshaven and Kiel they sent out their sinister submarines to prey upon the commerce of the world, neutral as well as belligerent. Against them the navies of the world were impotent. To the threat that by them Germany would starve England into cowering surrender, the only answer was a despairing effort to build new ships faster than the submarines could sink those afloat, even though 500,000 tons a month were sent to the bottom in wasteful destruction. Faced by these disheartening conditions, wondering what they might do that could be done quickly and aid materially in bringing the war to a triumphant conclusion, the American people listened eagerly to the appeals and arguments of the advocates of a monster aerial fleet. "Listen," said these advocates, "we show you a way to spring full panoplied into the war, and to make your force felt with your first stroke. We are not preaching dreadnoughts that take 4 years to build. We are not asking for 1,000,000 men taking nearly a year to gather, equip, drill, and transport to France in imminent danger of destruction by the enemy's submarines every mile of the way. We ask you for a cheap, simple device of wood, wire, and cloth, with an engine to drive it. All its parts are standardized. In a few weeks the nation can be equipped to turn out 2,000 of them weekly. We want within the year 100,000 of them. We do not ask for 1,000,000 men. We want 10,000 bright, active, hardy, plucky American boys between 20 and 25 years of age. We want to give them 4 months' intensive training before sending them into the air above the enemy's lines. In time we shall want 25,000 to 35,000, but the smaller number will well do to open the campaign. And what will they effect? Do you know that today the eyes of an army are its airplanes? Cavalry has disappeared practically. If a general wishes to pick out a weak point in his enemy's lines to assault, he sends out airmen to find it. If he is annoyed by the fire of some distant unseen battery over the hills and far away, he sends a man in an airplane who brings back its location, its distance, and perhaps a photograph of it in action. If he suspects that his foe is abandoning his trenches or getting ready for an attack, the ready airman brings in the facts. And of course the enemy's airmen serve their side in the same manner. They spy out what their foe is doing, and so far as their power permits, prevent him from seeing what they are doing. Now suppose one side has an enormous preponderance of aircraft, 6 to 1, let us say. It is not believed, for example, that at this moment Germany has more than 10,000 aircraft on the whole western front. Let us imagine that through the enterprise of the United States our Allies were provided with 25,000 on one sector which we intended to make the scene of an attack on the foe, say the neighborhood of Arras and Lille. For days, weeks perhaps, we would be drawing troops toward this sector from every part of the line. Through the reports of spies the enemy's suspicions would be aroused. It is the business of an efficient general to be suspicious. He would send out his airplanes to report on the activities of the other side. Few would come back. None would bring a useful report. For every German plane that showed above the lines 3 Allied planes would be ready to attack and destroy it or beat it back. The air would be full of Allied airmen, the great bombing planes flying low and inundating the trenches with bombs, and the troops on march with the deadly fléchettes. Over every German battery would soar the observation plane, indicating by tinsel or smoke bombs the location of the guns, or even telegraphing it back by wireless to the Allied batteries safe in positions which the blinded enemy would never hope to find. Above all, in myriads would be soaring the swift fighting scouts, the Blériot, Nieuport, Morin, or perhaps some new American machine today unknown. Let the wing of a Boche but show above the smoke and they would be upon him in hordes, beating him to the ground, enveloping him in flames, annihilating him before he had a chance to observe, much less to report. What, think you, would be the result on that sector of the battle line? Why, the foe would be cut to pieces, demolished, obliterated, blinded. He would be unrelentingly punished by an adversary, all eyes. Writhing under the concentrated fire of 1,000 guns, he could make no response, for his own guns could not find the attacking batteries. Did he think to flee? His retreating columns would be marked down by the relentless scouts of the air, and the deadly curtain of fire from well-coached batteries miles away would sweep every road with death. If, in desperation, he sought to attack, he would do so ignorant whether he were not hurling his regiments against the strongest part of the Allied line, and with full knowledge of the fact that though he was blinded they had complete information of his strength and disposition. The argument impressed itself strongly upon the mind of the country. There appeared, indeed, no public sentiment hostile to it, nor any organized opposition to the proposition for an enormous appropriation for purposes of aviation. The customary inertia of Congress delayed the actual appropriation for some months, but the President espoused its cause and the Secretaries both of War and the Navy warmly recommended it, although they united in opposing the proposition to establish a distinct Department of Aeronautics with a seat in the Cabinet. Being human, neither one desired to let his share of this great new gift of power slip out of his hands. Leading in the fight for this legislation was Rear Admiral Robert E. Peary, U.S.N., retired, the discoverer of the North Pole. Admiral Peary, from the very outbreak of the war, concentrated his time and his abilities to pushing the development of aeronautics in the United States. He was continually before Congressional committees urging the fullest appropriations for this purpose. In his first statement before the Senate committee, he declared that in the immediate future the air service will be more important than the Army and Navy combined, and supported that statement by reference to utterances made by such British authorities as Mr. Balfour, Lord Charles Beresford, Lord Northcliffe, and Lord Montague. In an article published shortly after his appearance before the Senate committee, the admiral summarized in a popular way his views as to the possibility of meeting the submarine menace with aircraft, and what the United States might do in that respect. He wrote: "We are receiving agreeable reports as to the efficiency of the American destroyer flotilla now operating against submarines in the North Sea. An unknown naval officer, according to the newspapers of May 30th, calls for the immediate construction of from 100 to 200 additional American destroyers. By all means let's have this force, when it can be made ready, but it would take at least 2 years to construct, equip, and deliver such a heavy additional naval tonnage, while 200 fighting seaplanes, with a full complement of machine guns, bombs, microphones, and aerial cameras, could be put in active service in the North Sea within 6 months. Seaplanes, small dirigibles on the order of the English blimp type, and kite balloons have already shown themselves to be more effective in detecting submarines than are submarine chasers or armed liners. Not only have the British, French, German, and Turkish forces destroyed trawlers, patrol boats, and transports by aircraft, but successful experiments in airplane submarine hunting have also been made in this country. In September, 1916, our first aerial coast patrol unit, in acting as an auxiliary to the Mosquito Squadron in the annual manoeuvres of the Atlantic fleet, detected objects smaller than the latest type of German submarines from 15 to 20 feet below the surface. A more complete aerial submarine hunt took place on March 26th of this year. This was the real thing, because the flyers were looking for German U-boats. Inasmuch as the Navy Department is still waiting before establishing its first and only aeronautical base on the Atlantic seaboard, the honor of having conducted the first aerial hunt of the enemy submarines in American history went to the civilian aviators who are soon to be a part of the Aerial Reserve Squadron at Governor's Island, and to the civilian instructors and aerial reservists connected with the Army Aviation School at Mineola, Long Island. These hawks of the air darted up and down the coast in search of the enemy, often flying as far as 11 miles out to sea. The inlets and bays were searched, vessels plotted, compass direction and time when located were given. No enemy submarines were found. It developed that the supposed submarines were 2 patrol motor boats returning from a trial trip. Nevertheless, the incident is illuminating, and the official statement of the Navy Department closed with the words: "This incident emphasizes the need of hydroaeroplanes for naval scouting purposes." It is also interesting to note what happened when Lawrence Sperry went out to sea one day last summer in his hydroplane and failed to return. 2 seaplanes and 3 naval destroyers were sent in search of him. In 40 minutes the seaplanes returned with the news that they had located Sperry floating safely on the water. At the end of the day, after several hours of search, the destroyers came back without having seen Sperry at all. Those who may still believe that we Americans cannot build aircraft, and that all the exploits we read so much about in the newspapers, taking place on the other side, are being done in foreign aircraft, will be surprised to know that a large number of the big flying boats now in use in the English Navy, harbor, and coast defense work are Curtiss machines, designed and built in this country by Americans, with American material and American engines. Great Britain wants all the machines of this type that it can get, and sees no reason why we cannot do the same thing in protecting our own Atlantic seaboard. I quote from C. G. Gray, editor of the London Aeroplane: "Curiously enough, these big flying boats originated in America, and if America is seriously perturbed about the fate of American shipping and American citizens traveling by sea in the vicinity of Europe, it should not be a difficult matter for America to rig up in a very small space of time quite a fleet of seaplane carriers suitable for the handling of these big seaplanes. If each seaplane ship were armed with guns, having a range of 5 to 10 miles, and if the gunners were practised in cooperating with airplane spotters, such ships ought to be the very best possible insurance for American lives and goods on the high seas. I quote from the Associated Press report from Paris on May 14th to show the relative importance of airplanes in submarine attacks. During the last 3 months, French patrol boats have had 12 engagements with submarines. French hydro-aeroplanes have fought them 13 times, and there have been 16 engagements between armed merchantmen and submarines. Henry Woodhouse, one of the most distinguished authorities on aeronautics in the United States, in his standard Textbook on Naval Aeronautics, published by the Century Company, has assembled the following data on submarine and aeroplane combats. On May 4, 1915, the German Admiralty reported an engagement between a German dirigible and several British submarines in the North Sea. The submarines fired on the dirigible without success, whereas bombs from the dirigible sank one submarine. On May 31, 1915, the German Admiralty announced the sinking of a Russian submarine by bombs dropped by German naval aviators near Gotland. On July 1, 1915, the Austrian submarine U-11 was destroyed in the Adriatic by a French aeroplane, which swooped suddenly and dropped 3 bombs directly on the deck of the submarine. The craft was destroyed and the entire crew of 25 were lost. On July 27, 1915, a German submarine in the Dardanelles was about to launch a torpedo at a British transport filled with troops and ammunition when British aviators gave the alarm to the transport and immediately began dropping bombs at the submarine, which had to submerge and escape hurriedly without launching its torpedo. On August 19, 1915, the Turkish War Office stated that an Allied submarine had been sunk in the Dardanelles by a Turkish aeroplane. On August 26th, the Secretary of the British Admiralty announced that Squadron Commander Arthur W. Bigsworth, in a single-handed attack, bombed and destroyed a German submarine off Ostend. Lieutenant Viney received the Victoria Cross, and Lieutenant de Cinquet was recommended for the Legion of Honor for having flown over a German submarine and destroyed it with bombs off the Belgian coast on November 18, 1915. Early in 1916, an Austrian seaplane sank the French submarine Foucault in the southern Adriatic. Lieutenant Calezeny was the pilot, and the observer was Lieutenant von Klinberg. After crippling the submarine, they then performed the remarkable feat of calling another Austrian airplane and rescuing the entire French crew, 2 officers and 27 men, in spite of the fact that a high sea was running at the time. It will be noted that Admiral Peary lays great stress on the supreme value of aircraft as foes of the submarine. This was due to the fact that at about the time of his appearance before the Senate Committee the world was fairly panic-stricken by the vigor and effect of the German submarine campaign and its possible bearing upon the outcome of the war. Of that campaign I shall have more to say in the section of this book dealing with submarines, but the subject of the undersea boat in war became at this time inextricably interwoven with that of the aerial fleets, and the sudden development of the latter, together with the marked interest taken in it by our people, cannot be understood without some description of the way in which the two became related. From the very beginning of the war, the Germans had prosecuted a desultory submarine warfare on the shipping of Great Britain and had extended it gradually until neutral shipping also was largely involved. All the established principles of international law, or principles that had been supposed to be established, were set at naught. In bygone days enemy merchant ships were subject to destruction only after their crew had been given an opportunity to take to the boats. Neutral ships bearing neutral goods, even if bound to an enemy port, were liable to destruction only if found upon visit to be carrying goods that were contraband of war. The list of contraband had been from time immemorial rigidly limited, and confined almost wholly to munitions of war or to raw material used in their construction. But international law went by the board early in the war. Each belligerent was able to ascribe plausible reasons for its amendment out of recognizable form. Great Britain established blockades 200 miles away from the blockaded ports because the submarines made the old practice of watching at the entrance of the port too perilous. The list of contraband of war was extended by both belligerents until it comprehended almost every useful article grown, mined, or manufactured. But the amendment to international law which acted as new fuel for the flames of war, which aroused the utmost world wide indignation, and which finally dragged the United States into the conflict, was that by which Germany sought to relieve her submarine commanders of the duty of visiting and searching a vessel, or of giving its people time to provide for their safety, before sinking it. The German argument was that the submarine was unknown when the code of international law, then in force, was formulated. It was a peculiarly delicate naval weapon. Its strength lay in its ability to keep itself concealed while delivering its attack. If exposed on the surface, a shot from a small calibered gun striking in a vital point would instantly send it to the bottom. If rammed, it was lost. Should a submarine rise to the surface, send an officer aboard a ship it had halted, and await the result of his search, it would be exposed all the time to destruction at the hands of enemy vessels coming up to her aid. Indeed, if the merchantman happened to carry one gun, a single shot might put the assailant out of business. Accordingly, the practice grew up among the Germans of launching their torpedoes without a word of warning at their helpless victim. The wound inflicted by a torpedo is such that the ship will go down in but a few minutes, carrying with it most of the people aboard. The most glaring, inexcusable, and criminal instance of this sort of warfare was the sinking without warning of the great passenger liner Lusitania, by which more than 1,100 people were drowned, 114 of them American citizens. Against this policy, or piracy, the United States protested, and people of this country waxed very weary as month after month through the years 1915 and 1916 Germany met the protests with polite letters of evasion and excuse, continuing the while the very practice complained of. But late in January, 1917, her government announced that there would be no longer any pretense of complying with international law, but that with the coming month a campaign of unlimited submarine ruthlessness would begin and ships sunk without warning and irrespective of their nationality if they appeared in certain prohibited zones. Within 24 hours the United States sent the German ambassador from the country, and within 2 months we were at war. At once the submarine was seen to be the great problem confronting us. Its attack was not so much upon the United States, for we are a self contained nation able to raise all that we need within our own borders for our own support, but England is a nation that has to be fed from without. Seldom are her stores of food great enough to avert starvation for more than 6 weeks should the steady flow of supply ships from America and Australia to her ports be interrupted. This interruption the Germans proposed to effect by means of their underwater boats. Von Tirpitz and other leaders in the German administration promised the people that within 6 weeks England would be starved and begging for peace at any price. The output of submarines from German navy yards was greatly increased. Their activity became terrifying. The Germans estimated that if they could sink 1,000,000 tons of shipping monthly they would put England out of action in 2 or 3 months. For some weeks the destruction accomplished by their boats narrowly approached this estimate, but gradually fell off. At the same time there was no period in 1917, up to the time of Admiral Peary's statement, or indeed up to that of the preparation of this book, which it was not felt that the cause of the Allies was in danger because of the swarms of German submarines. End of The United States at War, Part I. Recording by William Tomcho.